No.
Okay. Yeah, that would be wonderful.
And we also yeah. I went for Mark sheet of this. That was yeah. They were very much. Very good. Probably the toughest one. I mean, just that was for especially cheap, but so many revisions, like not in terms of like for different cases, like first people who are editing especially cheap, and then it was sent out to be and then came back some articles like this. Yes, even when you went through 6 releases, you
Andrew, you have KP has some late slides to slot in.
Set up. Yeah. No, in here no. Philipp is there. No. I don't
Yeah, so I've got 3 slides that we could, I mean, we could just give us and cut and paste it in so that they're in the same presentation.
Okay. Well, I'll leave you to do that. So we're currently broadcasting.
You're broadcasting, listening.
I mean, it's just the presentation and the voice.
Okay. It's just that I'm not very good at Windows.
That was a bit my feeling as
I
well.
might not be able to do it.
So,
So, hang on, where is it here? Oh, yeah, here we go.
ja, een beetje ja, dat is gewoon dat je in die tussen, zeg maar. En de
Control.
Instead of that,
I'm going to try. Are you a Mac person?
yeah, so we can delete that one. So that was Control V. I just didn't quite get what you did.
Control all is select all. Control A.
Control A.
And then Control C is
Yeah.
copy. And then Control D.
Yes.
Okay. If you just let me know when you finish, I'll ensure that it's
Yeah, but you should. By the way, I think
Are you fine?
We're fine, yes. Thanks very much. Yes, that works.
It works.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm still making some but it would be great if yeah, I'll ask her. I'm not sure.
I'll be with you.
Ja, want dan kan ik ook eventjes die punten, ja, omdat ik voel me verantwoordelijk. Oh, when yeah.
Seeing an old forest back to the spring.
So you will not
Still in the resistance.
resisting, yeah, amazing. Well, if you, well, if I have, or if you
Well, I think we should try and get together.
yeah.
Well, yes, but I know around. I sort of need a reason to come to see it. And so if there's anything like how we can cooperate with
Yeah, it will be very interesting. Yeah,
That is going to be harder to make, which is much. Yeah, about the problem.
how people conceive the position in regard to, actions being on their, like, are they radical or, no. Well, it's just a revolution, or is it like anything?
I guess we need to see that in there. I'll stay.
Yeah. Yeah, I wanna get on it.
Yeah. Well, it's really, we're gonna have to fight now.
Yeah, so that's the final. So then, and this area, then we will switch over.
Good afternoon, those of you who have decided not to go to the other clashing events. My name's Tim Cadman. I'm with Griffiths University, and I'm kind of presenter come moderator for this side event this afternoon. So it's very nice to have you here. And if you feel like moving to the front or coming and going, please feel free. So this side event that I'm giving today with my colleagues, Oscar Wiedeberg from the Vrije University of Amsterdam, Kate Dooley from Melbourne University, Lisa Elges from Transparency International, and we may have a whiz-in guest appearance from Klaus Radunsky, who is currently involved in various discussions with the Austrian Federal Environment Ministry. And we're talking today about a couple of things really, new approaches for both analysing and visualising the integrity of the global climate governance regime. So we're really, the five of us, going to be doing a bit of a riff on some chapters that we prepared for a book as part of an Australian Research Council project under the same title. There's a couple of copies floating around, so if you want to have a look at them, feel free. Let me hand that to you, madam. Thank you. So there's always a lot of talk about ethics and justice and whether it's in or out of the regime, or how fair and equitable, etc., etc. We hear a lot of ethical buzzwords within the climate negotiations, but what does this actually mean, and how can we conceptualise this, both in terms of a theoretical understanding of what we mean by integrity and what we mean by governance, but also in an increasingly complex world with more and more data, more and more information, particularly in the regime itself, more and more institutions being added on over time. How can we actually visualize this enormous, complex beast that those of us who are in it or on the outside know little pieces of, but really have no overarching conceptualization of looking at the architecture of the regime itself? So today we want to look at some ways of understanding issues around integrity and governance, and also we've got a couple of visualizations, ways of representing the enormous institutional complexity that climate negotiators, civil society actors and so forth confront when trying to interact with global policy regimes. So my little spiel at the beginning is fairly theoretical and not directly tied to the regime with examples. That will happen as the presentations go through, but it's just to give you a bit of a conceptual set of markers to help you think about what we mean by governance values and institutional integrity. So we often hear this phrase, this person is a man or woman of great integrity. How do we attach the idea of integrity to institutions? So obviously it's an ethical concept, but if we look at an institution from an ethical perspective, an institution really, in a sense, has integrity if it's prepared to ask hard questions about its value and its values. And if it is able to give honest and public answers to those difficult questions, and whether it can actually live by them. So we might understand integrity within an institutional complex like the climate change regime as an integrity system, which is driven by a public institutional justification, or PIJ. In other words, what the institution is for and what it says it will do. Then it's important to see that integrity breaks down into some smaller constructs. We talk about in the book the idea of consistency integrity, that an institution's actions accord with its public institutional justification. But also we talk about coherence integrity in the sense that an institution's governance arrangements itself internally fulfill it or help it fulfill its public institutional justification. But of course, there is always context. And context integrity is another important component of an integrity system, because that's really talking about the environment around the institution itself, its constituent groups, the other institutions it relates to, and hopefully this context also helps it enable its public institutional justification. Then, if all of these are working together, it's possible to say that this regime or institutional complex that we're looking at has comprehensive integrity. All right, well, that's fine. But what about the actual governance of the different bits and pieces that exist as well? So one of the points we make in the book is that governance is a value-neutral term. It really just refers to how an institution is steered or coordinated. It doesn't say whether it's steered or coordinated well or poorly. It's merely asserting that governance is about how things get done. But behind the steering and coordinating that goes on, you also have a series of governing values. So these are really more the higher order ethical drivers that lie behind an institution's public justification. For example, is it driven by, as I mentioned earlier, concepts of justice or intergenerational equity, etc., etc. But below these kind of higher order ethical drivers, if you like, that inform an institutional complex like the climate change regime, we also have governance values. So these really confer the degree of institutional legitimacy that you might see expressed within different components of the climate change regime. So we argue that the more comprehensive your governance values, the more legitimate your institutional complex as a whole is likely to be. And we look at a kind of gradation of values, thin values. So these are governance arrangements for steering or coordinating particular elements within the regime that really refer to things such as basic oversight, so accountability and transparency and so forth. But there are thickish values as well that go beyond the kind of accountability and transparency way of making sure that an institution at least is relatively well governed. And these capture broader concerns around who makes decisions and how those decisions are made. And then thick values are a rich portfolio, if you like, of ethical values, including deeper issues around how governance proceeds. Is there equality of relationship between the different actors involved? Is there internal democracy around decision-making arrangements? Is it inclusive, etc., etc.? So with that kind of theoretical front end, if we just have a kind of quick snapshot of the climate regime as an integrity system, it has a pretty clear public institutional justification in both the Convention and the Paris Agreement. Obviously, we have the language that goes back to the original Convention about combating dangerous climate change. We have a clear desire to aim for global temperatures, hopefully within 1.5 degrees centigrade. And this occurs in the context of sustainable development and efforts to eradicate poverty. It sounds fairly clear. In terms of the governance values themselves, in the book we run through a number of different institutional elements, and the conclusions that we draw is that the governance values themselves are thickish. Notably, in the Paris Agreement, we see increased commitments to transparency of climate finance, for instance, capacity building, and so forth. But when we look at those higher order governing values, those kind of more ethical drivers that inform that public institutional justification, why the convention is here, how deep are those values that underlie the regime? And if you just dive into the Paris Agreement and pull out a couple of quotes, it's interesting to see that, for example, it merely notes the importance of ensuring the integrity of all ecosystems, and it notes the importance for some of the concept of climate justice. So when we start looking at some of those really harder ethical issues, we see that perhaps the regime is not really as thick in terms of its institutional arrangements and its integrity as a whole. So just segueing into some of the visualization components that we have at the side event today. I'm still here spruiking to you, so I'll kind of change my hat now, and then I'll hand on to the others. So what's quite interesting when you go onto the UNFCCC INT site, as I'm sure many of you have, once you've got past all that newsroom stuff and you've actually found the link that will take you into the convention website itself, you'll notice how the site itself has evolved over different years, and in some areas it is more blog-like, in others it's more conventional kind of website from the sort of 1990s, 2000s. But there is no one single representation of all those many, many elements that make up the convention and its related institutions as a whole. There's about 4 or 5 in there if you dig around and have a look, but there's no single way of representing how the climate change is constructed and how you might see it as an integrity system. Well, does that really matter? Well, I'm of the view that it does, because it makes it quite difficult for negotiators and the general public to really know who's who and what's what. And for example, a number of climate negotiators, parties, they may only come to 1 or 2 COPs, possibly 3, before they're moved on to another ministry, have another portfolio responsibility. It's very difficult to actually work out who's who in the zoo, and so many people just tend to default to, you know, the people who can tell them, oh, this person's good to work with, or oh, didn't you know that the adaptation committee also is related to, and so on. So in a sense, not being able to see what the regime looks like can contribute to a lack of transparency around the different institutional subcomponents and activities. And in a sense, if we want to take a higher level bird's eye view of what's going on in the regime in terms of whether it's being effective in terms of its implementation in its different aspects, it's also quite difficult to be able to do that unless you're prepared to wade through millions and millions of documents. So this was one reason why we developed, say, a map of the regime, and I'll just give you a little walk through it now. For those of you who did bring your laptops, you can click on to just enter climateregimemap.net. It's optimized for Apple, sorry, PC folks, but it should still work okay, especially if you use Google Chrome. This is where I need Andrew. Can you click on that and take me there?
I'm not sure it might use the broadcast. try.
It's looking good.
That's going to explore.
Oh, yeah.
Do you want Chrome?
Yes, please.
Do you want to type in that?
Yeah.
Share your screen.
Yep. Just an apology to the physically present audience while we enable the rest of the world to participate in this presentation.
Find technician help you. Do you want to carry on?
Yeah, I'll carry on. One of the really interesting things about the exercise of how do you map a regime, how do you represent a regime, was working out the sensitivities of the hierarchical nature of human and institutional relations. So we went through a fairly extensive process of talking to parties, talking to CSOs, participants in the regime, using the two-dimensional maps that exist on the UNFCCC.in site, and this is what we came up with. So essentially, obviously, the overarching raison d'etre of this whole thing is the convention, but obviously it's actualized through the conference. As we know, it's the supreme body that meets once a year to review the convention's progress. But it itself is not just the conference, it's the conference of parties, and there are many state and non-state actors who come to COPs. Obviously, what gets decided at conference is actualized through a protocol or some other kind of institutional instrument. And then we have the Secretariat that relates both to the COP and also assists the permanent subsidiary bodies in the various tasks that they have when it comes to either providing scientific or technical advice or implementing aspects of the protocols or instruments that get negotiated. So can you share the screen for the people who aren't here?
Mm-hmm. I'll try to do my best.
Oh, it's not here. No.
Mm-hmm. Oh no, not me. Sorry. That's on the PowerPoint. It's working now. Okay. Yeah. It should be the same. I don't know why it's not working.
I wanted to just plug my Apple in, but that's forbidden. Yes.
We can look at the slide individually.
Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry, I will check with the technician if you can come on.
All right.
then I would. No problem. I would call the technician.
I share your frustration. To go here and okay. Let's exit this damn thing. Oh, I like that sound. All right, so let me just run this through again. All right, so we've got the convention, the conference, and all the different institutional subcomponents that make up the conference. We've got the protocol and or other instruments, and obviously now post-Paris Agreement, we don't just have Kyoto. But the Secretariat plays an important mediating role between the conference and the other permanent subsidiary body components. Those things that kind of they're like the engine of the regime. But of course, finance is an absolutely critical component to any regime, and finance occupies a large proportion of the different institutional elements that make up the regime. And then, of course, you have the implementing agencies and the national activities, national level activities themselves, and of course, the desire for reporting. So although it's a hierarchical representation in some ways, it's really just there to help people get a handle on what's going on. So we can see, for example, when we start looking at different thematic elements across the regime, how large or how small certain components are. For example, if we hover over technology, that's the little red bits. There's some in the Secretariat that has, and some within the permanent subsidiary bodies. If we look at capacity building, it's also fairly similarly small. But if we look at monitoring, reporting and verification, we can see that yes, there is a large amount of reporting that does occur at the national level, but we can also see that there's a role for reporting within the Secretariat and within the conference itself. Adaptation, as in a sense, not so much the new kid on the block now after all these years, but still far less institutional components focusing on adaptation compared to, say, mitigation, for example. And then just to show you how the map works. So, for example, you might have been in the ad hoc working group on the Durban platform for enhanced action. You click on there and it will take you to that particular place. It gives you a little explanation. It gives you an opportunity through more info to go to that website. And it also shows the different connections between that element and how it sits in terms of nesting. So this is just a different way of looking at it. You can see how things sit one within another. So for example, if we look at finance, which was that the green on the smaller map here, see how considerable finance is. If we look at finance here, we can see how the regime is constructed, that we have the finance mechanism, the non-UNFC finance mechanism components, and so forth. And then just what's for sort of interest's sake, you can also look at pre-Paris and post-Paris visualizations, and you're able to see how the institution evolves over time. And I would just encourage you all to go in and have a look at the different types of representation of the regime, but more importantly, if you are a negotiator or you're a student or you're a member of the general public, this is one way for you to find out how the regime is constructed. And I'm going to now move on. Yep.
Okay, thank you, Tim. And hi, everyone. My name is Oscar Berg. I am a researcher at the Vrije University of Amsterdam and their Institute for Environmental Studies. And together with Philipp Pattberg and a couple of others, we wrote a chapter in the book on non-state actors and subnational actors in the global climate regime. And very much, taking, let's say, where Tim kind of, stopped and saying we'd argue, that the global climate regime, let's say, have become more than the UNFCCC, right? We have more than only governments taking climate action. So we have cities, for example, we have, investors, we have companies, we have regions engaging, individually, but also in what we call cooperative initiatives. You have the non-state actors for climate action, which has, over 12,000 different climate actions or climate commitments. You have the Climate Initiative Platform, for example, with about 222 different cooperative initiatives, let's say. And what we wanted to do in this chapter was to, explore a little bit, okay, so what happens if we start to put these ones, I think we figured it out. Yeah, look, it works.
But your live stream now is showing your face.
Oh, that's not bad, though.
That's a good thing as well.
Yeah, maybe. So we can share well, we want to share the Chrome. The Google Chrome. Yeah, so internet. Okay, so that one's shared now.
Yes.
Super. Great. So what we did was that we have worked on a project for a couple of years called Connect. So this was the data that fed into our, let's say, the book and our chapter. And we've been collecting data on about 90 about different cooperative initiatives. And our idea was to think, okay, so we put this into a chapter, we put this into several academic papers, but being a bit inspired with Tim's work, what he's been doing here on the climate regime map, we were thinking, can we maybe visualize all this data in a different way than just putting it into academic papers and book chapters? Can we maybe put it online in a different way, such as what Tim has been doing with the climate regime map? So what I'm going to give you a little bit walk through the next, or a sneak peek, let's say, of the next 5, 6, 7 minutes, is a bit on what our preliminary results are. We will launch this site in a couple of weeks, maybe a month, but basically to take you beyond the regime itself, what Tim has shown is very intricate and complex in itself, to what is actually non-state and subnational actors doing, right? So let's see if I can actually figure this out. And if it works, because this is always... Fantastic. So we call it the previous project, we call it Connect, right? So now we call this Connect It. We're basically we created a project which has become, a behemoth of projects. So more projects are latching on. So we're coming up with more and more acronyms which have something to do with Connect. So this is Connect It. We will have Connect Some later, which will have something else to do. And the idea is here that, let's say, take the data that we had 90 into cooperative initiatives, let's say, involving non-state actors. Think of cities, think of regions, think of companies, think of investors. And what we did is that we collected all these different types of data on them, right? When did they start? Where are they based? What do they do? What kind of type of functions do they have, right? What are their home pages? And what kind of cooperative initiatives are they are the individual organizations, or what kind of membership does the cooperative initiatives have? So what we did is that we created a homepage, which is called Connect It. As I said, you can check it out here on this on the Connect It template01.info. And what the idea here is that we have 5 different sort of views. So the first view that we have is a very simple, let's say, overview of the world, where we've basically plotted where are the different cooperative initiatives based in terms of headquarters. So the more dark the country is, the more headquarters are based, or cooperative initiatives are based in a country, right? So we look at, for example, France. We do see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 different cooperative initiatives. And here you would think mainly of, for example, UNEP-hosted cooperative initiatives. And this is what you can basically tag in for any other country that you want in the world, which you start to see some things already. You start to see that it's quite northern-based, for example. You start to see there's a lot based in the US, in Europe, Germany, for example. So you start to get a little bit of better feel for what, how does cooperative initiatives actually, how are they spread across the world, right? The second view that we have, of 5 different views, is the quite conventional list view. So I think many times we've seen this is often how this data is represented, just as a view of kind of like, what is the acronym, what is the name, what is the date, so we can click here, for example, C40, right? We get a little bit of an overview here on the left side, or the left side, yes, on what it's actually doing. And this way you can just scroll your way down through the different ones, click the ones that you think are interesting, and get this kind of like overview information. The second type of view that we have, or third type, is just a descriptive view. What are the different descriptions of the different cooperative initiatives? So far, I think we've covered stuff which are not that new at all. If you look at, for example, the Climate Initiative platform, this has very similar, let's say, data functions as these ones. But we wanted to go a little bit beyond that, and we started to go to the fourth view, where we have what we call a disk view, or the bubble view, right? And again, notice that you can kind of just click your way through things all the time. Everything is clickable, everything takes you somewhere. The idea is to kind of play around with it, make it interactive, and let users, let's say, explore the data in their own way, right? So again, if you click C40, you get this little thing on the left explaining it. But maybe you've seen that here on the left side, we also have, let's say, a way to kind of start sorting and showing your data in a more advanced way. So we can start to think about, maybe we want more data here. So we start to show, for example, names, right? So you get the full name of the different acronyms. We maybe want the date on when they were published or when they were started. We want to see how many members they have. How many members are part of C40, for example. Then maybe we click that one. And what happens then is that the different bubbles, grow if the cooperative initiative is bigger, or they're smaller if they're smaller, right? So we see here Covenant of Mayors. It's a very big organization, or cooperative initiative, for example, compared to C40, which makes sense. We can also see, for example, what kind of type they have, right? And here we need a legend, which is also on the left side, where you see what are they doing? Are they engaged in standards, creating standards and commitments, or are they just sharing information and engaged in networking, right? Finally, we can also look at, when it comes to show, we can also show what kind of themes they have, right? What do the different cooperative initiatives engage in? So here we have, for example, again, we can look at C40, which is engaged in urban climate action, right? If we go here down to the little description. Again, you can click on it, for example, if you're interested in something with it. Then, of course, you can also sort it by that, right? So you can sort it by, for example, name, right? So here you have it by name, but then you get all the additional information that you have mentioned in the show box. Good. This is all. I'm inviting you all to just look through this. You can stop. We can stop showing it, and we go through the last view. This is for me maybe the most interesting one, and maybe the one where I see the most potential. And this is what we call the network view. So here, what we have done is that you've seen, let's say, the network start to move around a bit. Basically, what we have done here is we've taken the cooperative initiatives. We have looked at who's part of them, who's participating in them, and we've said if two in the cooperative initiatives share one member, right? So if Barcelona is part of Covenant of Mayors and C40, then they get a link, right? And the more of the shared memberships they have, the more and the thicker the lines are, right? So if we click, for example, on C40, C40, you get a blue line out. So you see who they actually share members with. And then you start to see that you get this interesting kind of cluster here of, you know, urban climate action. Because of course we can just, maybe we should tick in that one, the role one. No, not the theme one. So here we see, for example, that the urban climate action ones are quite clustered up on the left side. We can also tick in one of them. So we see, for example, UNFCCC, right? I hope so. Or we get C40 because we just tick that one. What we can do with C40 then is we can load, for example, membership information. What we do then is that we get the members to the C40. If we click, for example, Amsterdam, so my home city right now, we can see what other cooperative initiatives they are part of, right? So this is a little bit just to give you an idea on what we are trying to do with this platform. There are two things, maybe just to finish with. We're trying to also create this. This is a bit of a beta thing. We're trying to create, you know, to collect every kind of all the adjacent information, reports, you know, interesting what other databases, academic papers, for example, that are saying something about the cooperative initiatives. Think about, you know, the way they, you know, if we have, for example, case studies, if we have, for example, look at implementation levels, if, for example, how good they're doing or how bad they're doing, right? Then we're started to create this, let's say, database of additional information, which we would like to say, we say, look, guys, if you want to know more about this, here you can find it. In the end, this database will be, let's say, downloadable. The idea is to make all this open and free. If you have more, if you're more interested, you can also check out our FAQ page, which tells you more about why this was created and how it was created and by who. And I'm not going to click up the last slide, which I had on my PowerPoint presentation, but essentially, if you want to get in touch with us, also please visit the page, and we're open for all type of input and comments right now, because we're still in, let's say, very much of a building phase of this. Thank you.
Oops. There's been a suggestion that we get some questions while the tech's being sorted. I think that's not the CI. Any questions? Have we bamboozled you completely? Yes.
Thank you for those two presentations and those tools. My question, I guess, goes to their ultimate utility and what the plan is that once the tools are finalized, how you ultimately want to use them so that they can actually get their desired outcome, which is to inform people about the climate regime or about all the connections and linkages that currently exist within the different institutions. Is there plans to say work with the UNFCCC or with UNITAR or any institutions that are doing training for negotiators or for participants in the UNFCCC, alternatively for non-state actors as well?
Look, just to, the idea behind the regime map is it's designed for the general public, but it's also designed for negotiators. Just knowing what different elements are connected to which different elements within the regime would be incredibly useful, because, I mean, I remember my first COP back in 2000. I didn't know how anything worked. I didn't know what was related to what. I didn't know why is this thing called COP, but it's also, they have the COP and then they have this thing called CMP. So what's the relationship between COP and CMP? And then why does CMP relate to and so on and so forth. So the idea behind creating an architecture, an institutional architecture, is designed for people to work out where they live, but also to work out where other people live, and for the general public to realise, in a sense, just how complicated this beast is. When we launched this at the Global Landscape Forum in Paris, there were two responses to the map. The first was, because it was working a lot better there and more under my control, that the first thing people said was, wow, you know, is that, then the next thing they went, oh, where am I? Where am I? Oh, there I am. And then another common reaction was actually one of almost anger in realizing just how enormous and how complicated this regime was, and then a kind of a grateful response that finally there's some way that we can get a handle on what this thing looks like, even if it's just a conceptualization of what it looks like. So it's really designed as a kind of decision support tool and a research tool, and so on and so forth. It's also got opportunities for surveys, so people can click on a particular institutional component and take a survey and express their views about this, which then gets loaded into the computer. And then over time, people can track how the regime is changing. Oscar.
Okay, yeah. This is a great question. I think we get it almost every time I present this. Why do you do this? And I think there are many, I mean, there are three different ways. First of all, it's hard to figure out, you know, to think about one reasoning, right? And it depends on the audience. First of all, the public, I don't know which public it would be that would be super interested in this, because in general, I think there are other things to worry about when it comes to climate change, right? So I see it as a more specialist, let's say, tool. First of all, I mean, for analysts and academics and, you know, anyone who works on research, this is the interesting way to just, you know, show data. And what happens when you show data in different ways? What other ways can you, you know, what kind of other results do you see? So we started with the geographic view. You start to see where it's kind of based. When you start to go into the network view, you really start to see that there is a structure to the whole thing, right? So if you want to do a case study, you know, why not focus on the central ones, for example? So that's kind of the research way. That also goes into, for example, looking at advocacy. So if you have, you know, if you have 100 euros to spend, where should you spend it? And we would argue, well, you know, if you go to the ones that are the most connected, or more connected, or maybe you're interested in other centrality measures, then you get a more, you know, science-based, a more informed decision-making than just having a feel for who you think is connected, right? Or maybe you can add that to your own, you know, analytical box. The third one, I think, is for governments, but also the ones who are in our database, because we've noticed, I've been working with a couple of governments, we're working with a couple of cities, even companies who don't know what they're part of, because you have different, you know, different parts of the city sign up to different things, right? Or different parts of the government sign up to different things, which is just interesting for them also to get an overview of how it looks like, because often it starts with like, how do we engage with the non-state subnational, you know, world, and maybe just to start to, you know, give them a fun way or an interesting way of just seeing how you could visualize it is, for me, I think, a good start for a better decision making, let's say.
Just one final add-on. I mean, if I had a wish, it would be to have that on COP Negotiator. It seems really logical that, I mean, it's a great platform, COP Negotiator. It's got all the documents, but it doesn't actually have any way for people to navigate themselves through what they're actually getting involved in. So anybody out there has got more sway with the Climate Change Secretariat than I have, please let them know. All right, well, I'm going to make you all a bit dizzy. And we're moving on now to our next speaker. And I should thank Kate and Oscar because Kate is with Melbourne University. Oscar and Kate's institutions are the people who are sponsoring this this event. Over to you, Kate.
Oh, I've got it. Okay, there's a button. Okay, thanks very much. Yep, I'm Kate Dooley from the University of Melbourne, and I'm going to give a much simpler presentation. So drawing back from the mapping and the sort of interactive aspects of how to look at regimes, I'm just going to talk about the some basic, or core is probably a better word than basic, governing values of the climate regime. Do you want to move to the next slide, Tim? So as Tim pointed out at the start, we have a distinction between governing values and governance values. But when we start to look at the thicker end of governance values, they actually overlap a lot with governing values, because it's there that we get the very substantive and moral and ethical elements coming into to how a regime is governed. So in terms of the climate change regime specifically, it's very much seen as a moral and ethical problem, because we have the issue that those that contributed the most to the problem will be least impacted, and those that least contributed will be most impacted. So this has been the sort of principle that drives climate ethics and climate justice. In terms of thick governance values, which overlap a lot with governing values, across many international regimes, we see the same sorts of things, which are around sustainable development, the rule of law, sovereignty, human rights, democracy, and equity. So these are values in international regimes that are necessary to promote the comprehensive of the regime, but also acceptance, really, that participants accept and participate in the regime. The issue here is that the thicker the governance value, the more potentially political it is, and therefore the less consensus. So whilst, so that's what I'm going to discuss in this presentation to some degree. So human rights and equity are key governing values in the climate regime, but to what degree they're incorporated and how they're interpreted and implemented remain very contentious, which actually becomes, those following closely the negotiations will be aware, and I'll get to this on the last slide, causes sticking points in the negotiation process and within the regime, because we have these important governing values but different interpretations of how they should be implemented. So, so starting with equity, so I want to also look at whether to what degree human rights and equity are complementary or competing values in the regime. So equity is operationalized in the climate regime through the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities. It's a core principle of international environmental law coming out of the Rio Earth Summit in 1992, but very much a core principle of the UNFCCC. So it is in the convention, but also in the Paris Agreement and any major decisions that are made here. Common but differentiated responsibilities essentially refers to the notion that, as I've put up here, a quote from Dinah Shelton, that differentiated responsibility derives from the differing contributions of states to climate change and the difference in capacity to address the problem. So this so CBDR, equity in the form of CBDR, permeates all of the negotiations here, particularly post-Paris under the APA negotiations that are negotiating the rule book post-Paris. The degree of differentiation and how the concept of CBDR is operationalized between states is a core element of every part of the APA negotiations, and will continue to be so through the next few years in terms of figuring out how that should actually be operationalized. Human rights is there's an interesting contrast here, because human rights is a well-established normative framework globally. You could say perhaps the most successful normative framework that we have. in terms of a shared global values system. But it's actually been very difficult to get references to human rights in the climate regime. It is now referenced in the preamble of the Paris Agreement. I mean, so human rights is not mentioned in the convention at all, but following, there is one reference in the Cancun decisions after Copenhagen, and then following a concerted effort from civil society, human rights groups and bodies, indigenous peoples, etc., there's been a lot more mobilization of thinking about the overlap between climate change and human rights, which is obviously substantial, and how to get references to human rights in this regime. So we now have within the preamble that the Paris Agreement affirming that states must take human rights into account in terms of climate action. So the next slide, Tim. I can't see what you're doing there. So an interesting thing is to look then at the overlap between human rights and equity, and whether this helps us to move beyond seeing the overlaps between human rights and equity, and to what degree the synergies and that they strengthen each other helps us to incorporate both of them more strongly into the regime. So human rights instruments, so I've listed up here some of the key human rights instruments. We have the civil and political rights, which tend to be liberty orientated, more focused on individual rights, economic, social and cultural rights, which are collective, and as well as third generation rights, such as right to a healthy environment. All of these are sort of a more collective body of rights that are getting a lot more attention. So the collective aspect of human rights, as I've said here, supports, it ties back into the definition of equity I gave earlier, or the definition of common but differentiated responsibilities, in terms of it supports the equitable requirement for differential obligations. I should try and say that more simply. But the idea essentially, and particularly when we start to talk about extraterritorial rights, so the collective dimension of human rights also relates to obligations between states, and something like the right to a healthy environment, for example, relates to the obligation for states to uphold the global conditions that would enable individual rights, that would enable states to respect the individual rights that is their obligation of people in those states. So there's a big overlap between the collective dimension of human rights and equity in terms of CBDR that we have here in the regime. So incorporating both of those contributes to the regime effectiveness. And what I wanted to do just to finish up is have a look here at some of the, so this is a list of, all of the things in this list are currently agenda items under this complex climate regime that Tim mapped out for you. But this is not a list of all the agenda items. This is a list of agenda items where human rights or equity are substantive elements of what is being discussed. I wanted to particularly look at the first one, so guidance for nationally determined contributions. So this is APA agenda item 3, so countries are discussing guidance for the NDCs and to some degree features around how to maintain transparency there and accounting rules. So there's an opportunity here to integrate the recognition of human rights into what countries report in terms of their NDCs, as well as equity in terms of differentiated obligations for how NDCs are accounted. So taking account of the different capacity of countries as to what they can report in NDCs. That same principle goes through the transparency negotiations, which are agenda item 5, and then in APA agenda item 6 is the global stocktake, and the inputs to the global stocktake are agreed or recognized as being equity and science. So the global stocktake will take place on the basis of equity and science, and parties are now discussing science is a bit more straightforward and clear, and parties are discussing what does that mean in terms of how equity will feed into the global stocktake, which really comes back to how differentiation and different obligations for burden sharing is enacted among countries. This is one of the more contentious parts of the negotiations here in terms of there's very little agreement and there's quite a lot of difference in party positions. But thinking about the human rights dimension in terms of the collective aspects of human rights and the need to maintain the global conditions for human rights to be met strengthens the argument for equity and for the need for different levels of obligations between states in terms of how burdens are shared out within this agreement. So I will finish there. Thank you.
Thank you, Kate. Lisa Elges is from Transparency International, and she's looking at issues around climate integrity as they're expressed through money and power. And she's going to look specifically at 4 of the climate funds.
Okay, thanks. So I would say that in Tim's wedding cake or Big Mac, or however you might want to call it, what I'm going to talk about is the governance around the financial mechanisms, or the glue, the mayonnaise, the butter, the icing that keeps everything together, I would argue. And the specific mechanisms and their governance and why their governance is so critical in the larger picture. But also that as it relates to this study about looking at how strong governance is generally looking in these regimes. So just a thought, and I want to kind of define this a bit more because Tim introduced concepts of accountability and integrity. And I just want to put this, because he asked, you could say, oh, that person has integrity, right? But then how do you say that institution has integrity, and how do you get there? And I think that this is an important distinction, and I kind of want to give 2 examples of why. What is the difference between accountability and integrity? And in the chapter, I kind of tried to flesh that out in the sense that accountability is when you can fail in being accountable to achieving a certain objective without any fault. In other words, there's no negligence involved. So, for example, I'm a minister or a mayor or somebody who has decision-making power, and I'm like, okay, I'm going to choose solar. I'm going to go solar panels. I'm going to do renewable energy in my country. This is good. And it turns out that because of climate change, cloud cover has increased dramatically over the country, kind of failed on that renewable side, and therefore have to use other sources of energy, potentially even having to rely back on coal, right? So that's an accountability failure, and there's clear rules for that. He's held accountable to try to take renewable decisions toward a carbon neutral economy, but has failed, and there's clear rules around that. But he didn't know that, and he didn't mean to do bad. It just ended up that was the situation. So there's that in terms of accountability, and there are rules around that. And I think that's where accountability has achieved great levels of maturity when we're looking at climate finance across the board. Integrity is another story. Because it is linked to corruption and fraud, and it's something that's not that easy to detect, to determine, and it's a very subjective concept because it does involve negligence. It would be the same situation where Mr. Mayor or Mr. Minister takes the same decision for solar or for a hydro or for wind, but he chooses that wind park because he knows that his second cousin is having the company and he might benefit from that otherwise. And actually wind was not a good choice because there's actually, not even a slight breeze blowing through the country. So like basically it is a decision that is based on knowingly choosing something, making a decision, taking an action that compromises your integrity that is going to have, or you're not sure what the outcome is, but basically you've chosen something over the other. And that's very difficult to assess when we come to institutions. And therefore, we have efforts, including under the Paris Agreement and other efforts to try to bring as much transparency and accountability into the process to mitigate lack of integrity, because that's not what we want to see. And maybe we don't see that as much as the global level because all eyes are on global institutions because they're global. But when we dig down and we go further downstream, we do have that problem, and a lot of it. So this is why but this is also why the integrity, the governance, the standards that are set by financial mechanisms are absolutely critical for this discussion. Now, I'm just going to launch into my slides, so it's a little less. So when we look at the climate funds, and this is, so TI is coming up also with a comparative assessment across 4 of the main funds: the Green Climate Fund, the Adaptation Fund, the 2 climate funds under the GEF, the global, but basically we're looking at the Global Environment Facility and the Climate Investment Funds. And so I'm going to explain to that. But what we're looking at is these are the kind of, well, the Green Climate Fund and the GEF are the financial mechanisms under the Paris Agreement, but we also have other significant actors out there, right? So it's a comparative on their integrity policies. But what we're looking here is not only their integrity policies, but the accountability that exists, and kind of like this is another tier of looking at Tim's green circle and then the little parts in that green circle, and then digging down further, because if we went a couple levels more, we would see that these funds are funding other institutions that are then funding other actors and then funding other actors. So there's a long chain of actors involved in the delivery of climate finance and ultimately the climate goals, right? Mitigation and adaptation. And that accountability relationship becomes really important. And just as an aside, when we started looking at this as Transparency International 4 years ago, we went to the institutions themselves and said, so, hey, look, if corruption happened downstream in your arrangement, like, so who's in charge? Who's going to be held accountable? And basically the funds hadn't really figured it out at the top level. They didn't really know. And it sort of forced them to try to think about, okay, well, what is that? And that was a really important point in the conversation to start triggering that conversation and try to figure out what that is. I'm going to go into that in the next slide a little bit more. But basically what we have is another level of complexity in climate finance. And what I'd like to see with Klaus's network is to see then, I think that would also be a very useful contribution, is to look at the climate finance network and look at sources of private and public finance and see how that looks, which I suspect is going to be even more complex and interesting. But basically, this is the paradigm we have. We have a lot of funding being transferred through multiple channels with numerous actors involved, and the questions of how this is all governed in accountability and transparency. So the next slide is where we're looking at some of the things that we looked at, and I think it's interesting to look at this because of the impacts that this has. Now, what we found, and this is like looking at, as I said, the 4 funds, that the institutions themselves, when we're looking at the financial mechanisms, they were designed specifically to save the planet. They're environmental organizations. That's their reason, that they are just, this is their goal, this is their objective. The thought of governance and accountability and transparency sort of was an afterthought, and in fact, I can point specifically to the Global Environment Facility, which has been around for 25 years. And at the next council meeting in May, the 20th to 25th in Washington, they will be first deciding on their own ethics and conflict of interest policy for its council. In other words, the fund has been in business for 25 years and it never had a basic code of conduct for its board, its governing body. And this is a big advance for the GEF, but and it should be surprising, but it's not, because the institution, and this is also the governance, was formed as a partnership. It was formed on a concept of trust amongst multilateral institutions, largely UN agencies and multilateral development banks. We trust each other, we're friends, we're going to do this, we believe we're going to save the environment. We don't need to have rules and we don't need to have accountability because we're friends. And this has been kind of typically the way that has evolved. However, the Global Environment Facility, amongst others, it's not that they didn't think that accountability was important or integrity was important. They just didn't, well, maybe they didn't, but it wasn't a priority for them in terms of their reason for being there. Now that's become an issue with competition coming up for climate finance amongst these global funds, and with governments, including the United States, being less willing to be so generous in its contributions to different funds. So there's a competition, and there's a competition because one of the big arguments, I know that because one of our reports got abused by the Heritage Foundation in the United States, is that we shouldn't waste taxpayer money on funds that our money could be lost to corruption, right? So this is a big challenge, and we've seen a lot of advances in this area. So what's important is that what we have seen then is clear movements in the financial mechanisms to set integrity at the top. And it's really important that that happens because that sends the message downstream. And just to give you a sense then of why that's important is because this, actually we can go to the next slide. You can see that one of the big impacts of the global standard setting of these mechanisms is that they have an impact on governance and accountability and transparency in climate finance recipient countries. So there's a ripple effect. In other words, to receive money through these mechanisms, any institution needs to have the appropriate social, environmental, human rights, also fiduciary standards in place. That means in order to access the money, you have to be good, you have to have integrity, and you have to have accountability, and you have to show it. And because of this, this is creating, and it is an opportunity for a lot of reforms to happen, which reflects on a lot of reforms to happen in developing countries, and that reflects on and builds on the total understanding of climate governance regime, but just not climate governance, it's sort of like a global governance, and how that builds as a top-down approach, but also as a bottom-up point for leverage. And that's being demanded more as a part of the regime, because as we know, climate finance relies a lot on private finance. That's the climate finance, public money is out there, some might argue, to leverage private investment. In that sense, it's really important that there's kind of level playing fields emerging so that you can actually attract investment instead of deter it, because you're afraid that your investment might end up in a bank account, in an offshore bank account, or somebody's college education that you don't even know. So this is basically where we are. And I think that this is critical to the overall discussion of the climate governance regime. A couple of things that I want to point out and just end. What we've seen across the funds, going back to the previous slide, we've seen that there has been a lot of developments in terms of, as I said, integrity at the top. What we see are weaknesses, and I can talk forever about the good things, but I won't. I'm going to focus on the two things that I think that really need to change. And that is, we need a lot better transparency. And this also relates back to what Tim was saying about like trying to navigate through, understand, comprehend, get a feel for the UNFCCC's website because it's so confusing. But that's exactly what it is. There's a lack of transparency on what accountability rules are. Now, and I invite you to go to any of the Climate Fund websites and try to figure that out. Try to file a complaint against corruption. You won't find a button to push, and you should. Try looking at their information policies. The Green Climate Fund, which is fantastic. I mean, it has a really kind of corporate, sexy, cool website. try to find any policy in there. It's very, very difficult. They're all embedded in board decisions. So it's very difficult to find unless you're very intimate with the fund and you know exactly which board meeting that decision was taken, and to kind of flesh that out. So there's better transparency on accountability mechanisms and policies is really important. And the other thing is, and this relates to my other point, that governance or accountability might be an afterthought. Actually demonstrating that accountability is working is not good enough. We haven't seen how effective these institutions actually are in terms of demonstrating what they're doing to be accountable, and that's coming up. That's important. That's on the agenda. But this is where we are. So in a nutshell, yeah, it's a wedding cake.
Thank you, Lisa. Our final speaker on the panel, and I realise we're quite tight for time, but hopefully we'll have time for a couple of questions at the end. Klaus Radunsky is with the Austrian Federal Environment Ministry, and if those books are still circulating around, Klaus and I wrote the last chapter. It's an insider and outsider's perspective on the history of the negotiations and the COPs, and Klaus has been to almost all of them. So it's one of the very few linear historical accounts of the history of COPs. So it's worth reading. And Klaus will be speaking on an insider's perspective on strengthening the integrity of the climate negotiations to 2020, Subster 46 update. Over to you, Klaus.
Thank you, Tim, for these nice words. And good afternoon, everyone. I'm sorry that I missed the beginning of this side event, but I was engaged in negotiations for the European Union on the Nairobi Work Programme, which unfortunately started at the same point in time as this side event. But I was informed by the presentations, and I had the opportunity to receive the book much earlier. And so I want to share a few thoughts with you. My first issue is that I really want to thank the scientists and the scientific community for their efforts to investigate this process under the UNFCCC, and in particular the outcome of the Paris Agreement, because it's a real landmark, and it is, in my view, a good point in time to take stock where the process stands and where its weaknesses are and where further improvement might be required. And, you know, my quick assessment is we need not discuss the integrity as a value in itself, but I feel that the Paris Agreement meets a reasonable high standard in integrity, although the rule book of the Paris Agreement is still under preparation. And therefore, I believe it would not be justified to step back from the Paris Agreement in claiming that the agreement is unfair or biased. And one of the features of the Paris Agreement is that compared to the Kyoto Protocol, for instance, it is quite flexible. It's a voluntary bottom-up approach and not this top-down approach that was part of the Kyoto Protocol. And this was the result of many years of negotiations, and only on that basis it was possible to reach the broad support that the Paris Agreement saw. I feel now 144 parties already signed up to this protocol and ratified it. That's really a significant success. And furthermore, I want to clarify there's some criticism that the Paris Agreement is not prescriptive with respect to the global GHG budget. It is only prescriptive with regard to the temperature goal, and thus it does not prescribe a specific decarbonization rate, which is actually a big debate. What is the optimum on speed of decarbonization? And this is because there is no limitation in the Paris Agreement to the extent to which use will be made of other approaches than mitigation to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement. Furthermore, I feel what gives this status to the Paris Agreement is that a main driver was information from science, from the IPCC, and this will continue this input in the global stocktake every 5 years. And parties have demonstrated their willingness to support that process by the significant number of nominations to the scoping of the 1.5 degree special report by the IPCC, as well as to the scoping of the sixth assessment report of the IPCC. There was a scoping meeting just recently in Addis Ababa, which was very successful as far as I heard. So the scientific community really supports main features of the Paris Agreement. And this information relates to climate change impacts, to possible emission scenarios, to meet the temperature goals, which are required to meet it. And there will be also probably some consideration of the financial risks of stranded carbon assets, for instance, a topic that has not been considered so far under the convention, and which is, of course, essential, in particular for the private sector. Thus, it might need an even broader approach than the Paris Agreement to consider the linkages among all the above risks and find a way forward that offers a good future for all and does not leave anyone behind. Or, with other words, that is consistent with meeting the Sustainable Development Goals. Unfortunately, we do not have yet such institutional setting, although the Financial Stability Board created by the G20 has realized that such institutional setting would be helpful. And in closing my remarks, I feel that we should have on the table a full picture of the implications of the decisions, how we move into the future. There is agreement at the very end of the future. We want to be carbon neutral at the end, but it is open how quick we should move into that status. And in order to get something meaningful for all parties, we need something like the Paris Agreement in order to find a way forward for all. With that, I want to close, and I thank you for coming and demonstrating for me how serious this issue is. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Klaus. It's nice to, having at the beginning started at that really high sort of theoretical construct as to how we might understand institutional integrity, and then to see it brought down into looking at how non-state actors also can cooperate, or how some of those governing values, issues around equity and justice are or are not present in the regime. And then to look at some of the real accountability challenges that some of the mechanisms under the finance element, some of these really difficult issues that they have to institutionally take on board. And then, of course, to hear Klaus's wrap of where things are at with the Paris Agreement, and to hear even that people are opening up the Paris Agreement as to whether it's fair or unfair. So thank you to the panel. And then we've just got a few minutes. If anybody has any specific questions, you're very welcome to ask.
Thank you very much for such an insightful presentation and yes, discussion. My question was to Kate regarding the public participation in the, was it the processes? I think it's the intergovernmental processes. Maybe I need a little more clarification. I'm sorry. Thank you.
So I'm not entirely sure of what the question is. I mean, there is a meeting happening right now, a workshop from 4 to 7 on non-stakeholder, non-party engagement in this process. Is it related to that, or is it related to, because I didn't mention a particular participation process?
Oh, okay. I saw it in your presentation when you were talking about SBSTA and human rights.
Yes. So that is, yeah, so that is the process I'm referring to. So yeah, at the list at the end, there were a bunch of different processes that are going on that are relevant to human rights and equity. And one of them is the non-party engagement, non-party stakeholder participation. There's a few different issues happening there. One is the need to enhance, maybe I'll break it down into 3, the need to enhance non-party participation in this process and the importance of observer participation for transparency of the process. And it's also, in terms of the creation of the regime and the agreements that come out of it, such as the Paris Agreement, the engagement of non-party stakeholders adds a lot of integrity values, such as human rights in the Paris Agreement probably wouldn't be in the preamble without the intense engagement we have of civil society here. The second element is the desire for, I don't know if desire is the right word, but the desire for this regime to become broader in terms of the implementation of the Paris Agreement is not just about state actors, that it's also non-state actors, and so business and corporations and other actors play a major role, finance institutions, as Lisa was talking about. And the third element is conflict of interest. So something that is being discussed in the workshop today is conflict of interest in terms of, which in a lot of other regimes is, and Lisa might know more about this than me, but in a lot of other regimes there are clear conflict of interest policies so that those non-state actors who participate are not participating with a conflict of interest, and we don't currently have any such policy in the UNFCCC, so that is also very important.
Actually, this has been bugging me since Cancun when I went to a red discussion, and this guy from Walmart, I think he was the CEO, had a pink badge. And it's still bothering me how corporations can get on government delegations. Our chapter in Kenya, they are on the government delegation, right? I don't know of any other international process that allows people who belong to clearly different constituency groups to kind of cross borders. And I think that is, I don't know what you all think about that, but this is for me a really fundamental institutional conflict of interest that has been around for quite a long time. And I don't know what your thoughts are on that, but maybe that's not the question you wanted to ask, but it's something that I think is fundamentally flawed in the participation because it's unequal access. It's unequal access. It's not fair that my chapter colleague in Kenya can get access to government meetings because he has a government badge and I can't. That's not fair. Thank you.
Any last questions, observations from the floor? All right, well, I should just say thank you to Routledge. If any of you feel particularly emotionally or intellectually attached to those 2 copies of books, you're welcome to take them away with you. And if you would like to order extra copies, by all means, there's some flyers with a special discount. And thank you all very much. And thank you for being patient with our technical issues, which of course is one of the real challenges to this complex world that we live in. Is the two-dimensional screen is almost not enough for us to understand what it is we're actually in here at Subster 46. Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah, sorry. Oh,
This is something.
That's cool. You can actually fill it.
Yeah, that's what's good point, right?
I love it. I'll close off the yes.
So,
Great work. Nice.
it's fine.
Yeah.